Thank you for listening to the Limitless Spirit podcast. This is the conversation about faith, hope, and the impact we're designed to make as Christians on the world around us. Your host, Helen Todd, the Vice President of World Missions Alliance, has spent over 2 decades traveling to the world's hotspots to meet the spiritual and physical needs of those who are desperate. She interviews guests from different walks of life whose stories, books, and ideas examine today's most pressing issues and challenges of being a Christian today and inspire you to action.
My firstborn son, Louie, was diagnosed with stage 4 neuroblastoma. It was a childhood cancer, and they could not remove the largest tumor because it was wrapped around a major artery. When Louie died, I did go through the phases of grief, but it seemed I got stuck. I remember being angry for a very, very long time. And then it was like hopelessness.
This was Melinda Fazzolari. She's my guest today on the Limitless Spirit podcast. I'm Helen Todd. As you just heard, Melinda went through an unthinkable tragedy as a young mom. Her son Louie died before he was 2 years old. Melinda had a relationship with Jesus and tried to keep believing in God's goodness, but then a woman at her church said something really insensitive, and Melinda spiraled into a dark place. And that's where she got stuck for more than 20 years. But God is the author of Melinda's story. Even though she'd given up hope for ever finding relief, Melinda found healing through a handful of different experiences that reminded her that God loved her, cared for her, and never left her side. Those amazing stories are what Melinda is going to share with us on this episode. I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I'm excited to get back to our Greater Purpose series where we're letting people talk about how God has shown them what their greater purpose in life is. For Melinda, she's been able to use her testimony to help other people get through their grief or better understand their loved ones who are stuck grieving. Let's listen to her now. Hello, Melinda. Welcome to the Limitless Spirit podcast. I'm so thankful you agreed to be my guest today.
I am very grateful that you asked me, and thank you very much.
Your story begins when you accepted Christ as a young girl at the age of 17. And like most young girls, your dream was to be a wife, a mother, and it seemed like your dream was coming true until a terrible tragedy happened. Can you share a little bit about what happened?
Yes, it was December 10th, 1987. My firstborn son, Louis, he was sick for a few weeks, and I was at the doctor's 2 to 3 times in a period of 7 weeks. So 3 times a week for 7 weeks. I knew there was something wrong with my son. He was 13 months old at the time, just a baby. And I was 4 months pregnant with my second child at that time.
Oh my. So what was wrong with Louie?
Louis was diagnosed with stage 4 neuroblastoma. It was a childhood cancer.
And what did you do from that point on?
We were in the hospital. He was very sick. He was we heard after he passed that he was in the last stages right there. He should have died before Christmas of that year. So we were in the hospital for that length of time, and he was getting treatments, and they could not remove the largest tumor because it was wrapped around a major artery, by his kidney. So it just was not possible.
So how long did Louis suffer with cancer from the point that he was diagnosed?
It was about 6 months.
I can't even imagine how it felt. No mother should really go through this grief of losing her child. So what happened? How did you cope with that?
I did not cope very well. When Louis died, it was May 31st, 1988, and I was a mother of a baby who was only 3 weeks old, my daughter Amanda, and I just did not handle it very well. I have many moments, I would like to say even months, of no memory. That's how your mind is a very fragile thing. And I believe that through God's protection that he did that for me too, because my husband said I wouldn't want to know how it was because that's how bad it was.
So you were a Christian. Did you try to reach within your faith for help, or you were too broken to even try?
Yes, I tried. They set up appointments for me to speak to some psychiatrists, psychologists, and they wanted to heavily medicate me, which I was against. I had a little baby at home, and it's something that I'll never forget. I was already so numb, and I didn't want to be more numb than I was. I wanted to feel. I can't explain it any more than that. I wanted to feel.
They talk about these phases of grief. Did you go through these phases, or did you get stuck at one of them?
I did go through the phases of grief, but it seemed I got stuck. I remember being angry for a very, very long time. And then it was like hopelessness. I can't even explain the way I felt. And maybe it was because of a woman and what she said to me at church, a person who was supposed to maybe help me. And but I felt her words were so damning to me that it really just, if I could say, put the nail in the coffin for me, and I became like the Walking Dead. She told me my son died because I didn't have enough faith.
That's a terrible thing to say to a mother, a grieving mother, to a parent. And it's just heartbreaking even to realize that this was a person of faith who said that. So you ended up in deep grief for 23 years. Do you feel like this prolonged grief took something away from your life and the life of your loved ones?
Very much so. It robbed me and my husband of having, we were always very close. And don't get me wrong, we had a very good marriage. But my husband suffered, he lost a child. So he not only bore his own grief, he bore mine for that many years as well. And then I had another child after Amanda, my son Daniel, and they had told me maybe after God healed me that they never wanted to tell us, but our household was a very sad household to be in, and especially at the holidays. At Christmas time, at Thanksgiving, there was always something missing, and I was always very adamant to remind them that there's somebody missing. So yes.
Do you feel, looking back, that there were things you could have done then, maybe to help yourself, that you would do differently?
I could have, yes. I would have reached out to find that someone who would have just listened to me. I had my mother, I had my husband, but I needed somebody that I could just lay it all out, because I know when God healed me and I was able to do that with my closest friend, there was such a relief, a release, and like that whoosh, when you can just breathe out that long wind of air and just be, this is done, this is finished. And that's how it felt.
You shared with me that there was a moment in your journey when God sent you a wake-up call through someone who ministered at your church. Can you tell about this story?
There was a lady who she has since passed away, but I was working in the missionette and they assigned me with her. And she was just the dearest lady. And finding out later, she went through tragedies in her own life, and usually hurting people that have made it to the other side, they have the greatest appreciation and the deepest sympathy for somebody else. It's like they can see it, and she could see it in me. And she was ever so patient. She just came alongside of me. She would always give me an encouraging word. And tell me she's praying for me, and the cards and letters that I got from her, even I was with her all the time. I still have those tucked away in my kitchen and throughout my house, and I read them every so often. And I want to be that woman. She added so much to my life, and she was a saving grace in my life. We need to come alongside people, and she never put me down, never said I'm crying too much or I'm venting too much. She just listened.
Was she the one who handed you a rose and told you that God wanted you to take a step of faith?
No, that was not her. So this was maybe halfway through my journey. So this woman, I never met her before in my life. I was volunteering, and she was talking about her transformation, how God healed her from terminal cancer, how she was a prostitute, a drug user, and I was there with women I was mentoring. And I remember thinking in my mind, they better be listening. And here, to my surprise, God said, Melinda, this is the day you will grieve no more. Not that you'll never stop crying, but you will not grieve no more. And she handed me the rose and she pulled me up. And she said, God wants you to take a step of faith. And, in my mind, I was thinking, you've got the wrong girl. There's nothing wrong with me, because I had settled it years ago that this was how it was going to be. I was never going to be any better. Every day was as worse as the next, and that was it. So it was just incredible that, God just surprised me. And that's how I would put it. I was surprised. God was reminding me how very special I was and how much He loved me, and He never gave up on me.
So you were able to finally confront the fact that even though you thought you were okay, you were not okay. And so now you had to deal with it and find a release. So how did that process happen?
Well, I remember that night because I was still kind of miffed about what was going on. I go, God, I don't really understand what's going on. But I said, I'm going to trust you. I said, I know you're going to show me. You're going to speak to me. And I'm just going to surrender it all to you right now. And I remember for the first time in a long time, I slept well. Probably for the first time in a long time, I didn't wish I didn't wake up in the morning. I couldn't wait to wake up in the morning. And when the morning came, I felt so refreshed, so revived. And I began to hear from God. And not that I didn't hear from Him before, but this was something very incredible. He started speaking to me in ways that my fragile mind would understand, because He knew that I was still wavering and still in that grief, that He was going to make it very plain to me.
So how did he make it plain? What are some of the ways that he spoke to you?
A few days later, I was mowing the lawn at church. I took care of the lawn at church, and I was listening to my songs. And God told me, He said, your name should have been Mara, because that's how bitter you've been. And I was shocked. I was like, I actually heard Him say that to me. And then He started speaking more. He says, but I'm here, and your name is going to be Mara no more. You are going to be a woman of joy. And then another day, I remember I was in my backyard, and there was a little baby bird that was wounded. And I remember, and I love birds. So I picked up that bird and put that bird on the palm of my hand, and that bird just sprawled right out. And I remember God saying to me, Melinda, you were that baby bird. You were helpless, hopeless, but I was here the whole time. The way you're holding that bird is the way I held you.
This is so beautiful. So you felt like one of those people that Jesus healed. And once you're healed, you want to share this testimony of healing. So how did you go about that?
Well, like I said, I remember I was able to speak to my girlfriend, my best friend. We went on a road trip to Wisconsin to see her daughter. So there was an 11-hour car ride. And I remember I probably talked as we passed two state lines. I just put everything on the line and brought it all out. And my girlfriend never interrupted me. She listened. And she told me after she felt so honored that I chose her to tell the whole story, all the details that maybe some people will never hear. Some things I'll never tell anybody, but she heard it all. And like I said, it was such a release. And that was at the end of August. I got healed in May. This was at the end of August. And I remember running. I was a runner back then, and was running a rural road. And I had my headphones on, listening to praise and worship. And all of a sudden, I just felt the love of God come on me very strongly. And I said, God, I never thanked you for Louie's life. I know I probably did, but this was different. I was thanking him for allowing me to be this little boy's mother. And then I thanked him for his death. And maybe that's hard for people to understand, but Louie's death was a gift to me. Maybe it's a gift I didn't want, but in life, I have such an appreciation, such a deep sense that I would not have had if I never went through this experience. And really, Louie's home. I don't ever have to worry of where he is. He is in the arms of Jesus. And God, through all this, God has taught me about the eternal things. The eternal things are so much more important than the earthly things, because sometimes we get stuck on all these earthly things going on. So my mind is on the eternal. My son is home.
I remember so very well September of 2017, the first mission trip that you took with World Missions Alliance, and we were together in the Republic of Georgia and Armenia. What prompted you to go on that mission trip?
In April of 2017, so prior to this mission trip, my husband and I were on vacation, and we were in St. Thomas. And I remember telling him we were just getting ready for the day. And I said, Lou, I want to go on a mission trip. And he told me to call my friend Linda because she was thinking of it too. So I did call her. And I think we prayed and we said, we're going to sit on it and see what God is going to do. That night, God gave us both a dream of Armenia. And I knew in that moment that I was going to go. I've always wanted to go on a mission trip, but I do believe that this was God's timing in this, that this is what I was meant to do, to go to Armenia and the Republic of Georgia.
So there was something that happened during this mission trip that made a big impact on you. Can you share about that?
Oh my goodness, there was so much. The first time I spoke, because I spoke twice on that mission trip, and I remember after I spoke, one of the team members said that they wanted to talk to me. And she was explaining that her mother had lost several children before she was born. And she felt like after talking to me, she understood her mother. And I remember when we were in Armenia, she had asked me to tell my story again. And then she spoke after me talking about suffering. And I was blown away thinking, God, how could you use someone like me? And, I think of myself so insignificant at times, and that, I'm only one person, but your story, all our stories matter. God is just so good that I just sit back and laugh sometimes that, okay, I'm being used by God. I just was so amazed. And I remember, Helen, coming home from that mission trip, and I told my husband, I said, I found what God would want me to do with my life. It touched me that much.
Since then, you have been to many countries and you have shared your testimony even in your own community. What are some of the other moments that you remember when you knew that sharing your story really helped someone?
I went to Ireland on my second trip, and we were actually on an off day. And I remember we were at, it was called Old Head Cliff. And we were at the cliffs. We went to one side and then the other. When we went to the other side, there was this woman sitting on the rocks overlooking the cliff, and she was in tears. And my friend approached her, and we began to talk to her. And we just kept loving on her. And I recognized that she was hurting terribly. And you know what amazes me, Helen, is that here I am, a woman from Niagara Falls, New York, go to Ireland on a mission trip, and I'm speaking to a girl from Hungary. This was her last day in Ireland, and she was leaving to go home to her native country of Hungary. And she said that she wished that she could have met us women sooner because her countenance just changed. Jesus was doing something in that moment. And I remember as we walked up the hill with her, I asked her if I could pray with her, and she says, "You could pray later." And God told me, "Pray with your eyes open." And I remember touching her shoulder, and I remember telling her that God has not forgotten her, that God loves her so much, and that if she just, when she goes home at night, that just ask God, if you're real, if you are real, show me. And I know that I'm going to see Clara in heaven, because that woman was so touched. She says, "I can't believe that I met you two women, during this time." And I mean, that was just unbelievable. And I mean, there's several stories like that. A couple stories happened in Ireland too. I was sitting on the bus with another team member, and she said she wanted to hear my story because she had to go home early. So we sat on that bus, and she's crying. And we were, the bus ride was like a long bus ride, so I must have talked for a long time. And then she shared the story how her father died and how her mother was just like me, in that deep grief. And I prayed for her, and I gave her some tips, and I had talked to her a year later, and things were better. That just blows my mind that I met this beautiful girl, and that I'm able to share, and not thinking that my story is going to make a difference to this young girl, but it did.
This is interesting. I'm listening to you tell your story, and you mentioned how one of the people that helped you was able to understand you because she herself had suffered much, and so she understood grief and she could sense grief. And it seems like this is something, a gift that God has given you to be able to feel other person's grief at the right moment and reach out to them in a way that someone else probably can't. So I know that there are many listeners that are listening to you and relating because they too are either in the process of grief or have recently gone through this deep grief. And we're approaching major holidays now. That has been a very crazy year. And I know that there are people listening to us right now for whom this holiday is going to be without a loved one. And it doesn't only apply to loss of a person. It could be a loss of relationships, a loss of a job, any loss, any circumstance in life that causes us grief. So what would you say to those who are facing holidays in 2020 with a sense of loss and grief?
Allow yourself to grieve. Grief is normal, but remember that grief is not a place to stay. Find that one person, maybe two, that you can talk to, that you can be safe with. And don't allow the pressures of maybe family members or those that have not gone through what you went through. Make your own decision of what you would like to do. Don't force yourself to go to somebody's house, or maybe you start a new tradition, but just allow yourself that time, that you don't have to feel pressured from somebody else to do something. Just allow yourself to breathe, to grieve, and just call on the name of God. He is close to the brokenhearted, and he's not only close to the brokenhearted, he binds up their wounds. That's what he does. He'll add to your life.
And what would you say to someone who, like you, is maybe stuck in that cycle of grief beyond? And I know there is no recipe, there is no formula to how long you should grieve, but sometimes, like in your case, 23 years is a little long. So what would you suggest for those who maybe made grief their destination rather than a process?
Stop believing the lie that it'll never get better, because that is a lie. Because with God, all things are possible. God will rewrite your story. I remember clinging to Psalm 91:4, It says, He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is body armor and shield. Just run to God and hide under His wings and just tell Him. And Helen, there were many times that I contended with God. I told Him how displeased I was. I told Him how angry I was. And at times, you know what? He didn't hammer down on me. He listened to me and He loved me. And in many instances, He answered my prayers. Believe it or not, we serve a very loving God. And find that one person, a pastor, a counselor, someone that you can just talk to and lay it all out. And that's the one thing that I believe I found worked for me. I found that the longer the enemy could keep me quiet and not let these things out, the longer I stayed in grief, if that makes sense.
You mentioned that God rewrites our stories. How did He rewrite yours?
Well, my story was a beautiful tragedy. That's how I always saw my story, is that it'll never get better. You could hear violins playing in the background, and it was just a sad ballad. And, when God healed me, I was like, no, why did I believe my life was a tragedy? And it was just like God turned that page and He just said, no, Melinda, you thought your life was one way. And that's it right there, Helen. I could only see it through tunnel vision. I could only see my life through my small mindedness, my weak eyes. But God, He sees things through His eyes. So He always sees more than what we can see. So that's what I try to do. I look at the situation now, and believe me, I've been through grief again. My mother had just passed away in July, so I'm going through the grief again. But I start to see things through God's eyes in a bigger picture, that I will not get stuck. I refuse to get stuck in that grief again. And I encourage myself in the Lord. And I tell myself I will not believe the lie of the enemy, that I will believe God's word against anything else.
So has God shown you through this experience and other circumstances in your life, what is Melinda's purpose in life? What is your greater purpose?
It's making the most of the moments. You have to allow yourself to be interrupted, if that makes sense. Life is so busy. It'll always be busy. But no matter if I'm on the mission field, no matter if I just step out my front door, there are people to encounter. And just like when I was in Ireland and I met up with Clara, when I was on a day off, I allowed my life to be interrupted by this woman as I'm taking in God's beautiful creation. It's about allowing yourself to be used. You have to be willing to allow yourself to be used in a way that you can't even imagine. And some days I just look at it and say, God, I can't believe I would have missed that moment if I didn't stop what I was doing and address this person, or maybe started a conversation. It could be anything, but you have to allow yourself to be used.
This is beautiful. Thank you so much, Melinda, for sharing your story with us and being transparent with the challenges that you have faced. This will be an encouragement to many.
Thank you very much, Helen. I appreciate it. And it was an honor and a privilege.
It is really amazing to hear how God has transformed Melinda's life from one that was marked by grief to one that's marked by joy in the Lord. She has so much wisdom to share and compassion for people who have gone through what she has went through. I especially appreciate when she was talking about how much our stories matter. When you know Jesus and when He has transformed your life, you have a powerful story to tell others. I hope you never forget that. That's one of the reasons why we do this podcast, to share the stories of how God is working in people's lives and leading them to their greater purpose. We're also planning an event next year called the Greater Purpose Conference. It's scheduled for May 2021, and I hope you consider being involved. You can find more details about this event and other work we do here at World Missions Alliance at our website, rfwma.org. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Limitless Spirit podcast. Until next time, I'm Helen Todd.
Limitless Spirit is produced by World Missions Alliance. If you believe in the importance of the Great Commission, sharing Christ around the world and helping those in need, check out our website, rfwma.org. If you liked what you heard, consider supporting the Limitless Spirit podcast by going to rfwma.org/give. Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform and leave us a review. Tune in next week for another exciting episode.